Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to our little humble abode. Welcome to those of you here physically and those online. I'm tempted to do a quick test for those online as to how many left turns to get to the men's loo.
I think they missed that bit.
But yeah, well, the online people didn't hear that. But I'll leave that. I'll leave that. Let's just hope we don't have a disaster. In 2021, the Climate Change Commission released a report which included a scenario showing the contribution forestry could make to New Zealand's net zero target for 2050. There's natives in purple and exotics in brown. I was immediately sceptical about the scale of native forest establishment suggested. Now, this was a development pathway and it was a modelling pathway, so we know how models are put together, but inevitably people seize on that, aha, natives. And as I say, I was immediately sceptical, but as someone who's battling to establish a few mere hectares of natives on my own property, the feasibility and affordability of such a large area seemed to me questionable, at least. So this report began as an attempt to answer my questions. It was an inquiry about what we know and don't know about the large-scale re-establishment of native forests. But before long, we realised that we couldn't ignore the reasons why people plant forests, which led us to other types of forest and other trees and other ways of doing forestry. And finally, to the underlying larger question, what is driving afforestation in New Zealand? So that's really what this report finally settled on after its 2.5 years gestation. Prior to 2008, the decision to plant forests was driven by two distinct imperatives: commercial returns from timber production or holding the land. On the one hand, forestry companies planted forests to provide feedstock for commercial products, timber and fibre. And that land those forests were planted on was purchased on the basis of its ability to grow good trees and its distance from processing and port facilities. On the other hand, nature itself played a part in identifying land in need of afforestation. Cyclone Bola, nearly 40 years ago, provided us with a stark example of what can happen to young, steep, geologically unstable land when trees are removed. But even less dramatic evidence of soil erosion than that led to conservation tree planting across wide areas of hill country. In fact, it long predates Bola. Whether the motivation was commercial or driven by a need to move away from pastoral farming in some places, one species was overwhelmingly the preferred choice, Pinus radiata. Radiata pine has been the dominant and unchallenged option for large-scale forestry in New Zealand since the early 20th century, with almost all of it managed for production under a clear-fell regime. This is the result of decades of targeted research and development to deliver the volumes of timber that the native estate could never supply. But with the creation of the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme in 2008, a significant new financial incentive for afforestation arrived. The scheme, with its offer of unlimited forestry offsets as an alternative to reducing your emissions, incentivized significant afforestation-led land use change. And it also had the effect of supercharging the dominance of radiata pine, since this is the species that provides high returns through its rapid carbon sequestration rates. There were hopes that the NZETS might incentivise alternative forestry systems, particularly native afforestation. But realistically, under the current settings, almost nothing can compete with radiata pine. Now, I want to be clear in releasing this report that I do not take issue with production pine forestry. Radiata pine has and will continue to have an important role in this economy. Sited appropriately and managed well, it provides a sound economic return and local employment for products destined for both domestic and export markets. It continues to generate revenue and economic benefits long after any carbon dividend has been spent. It can also provide environmental benefits. The people who plant production forests do it to make a buck, and they look after them along the way. It's a pretty good recipe. But if we're going to continue to drive large-scale afforestation whilst advocating for alternative species, in particular natives, then we should stop to consider what sort of forests we want long-term and what benefits they might provide. Should we continue to encourage pine alone, especially for carbon, or look to alternatives? And could some alternative forestry systems provide wider environmental benefits for New Zealand and address some of the risks of our current approach? Now, Alt F Reset, and the title is deliberately mysterious, and by the end of reading it, you'll have worked out what it's all about, considers these questions. It discusses the alternatives. There's chapters on new native forests, forests of exotic species like woods or eucalypts, forests of mixed species, and a relatively new option, transition forests, where exotic forests are used as nurse crops for natives and help fund native afforestation. So there's a lot of just information being brought together on these different types of going about afforestation, and also looks at what we know about the environmental benefits of different management regimes and challenges preconceived ideas about forests. Why not have native forests planted for timber production or exotic forests established for biodiversity reasons? Māori provide a unique perspective on managing forests and developing a more environmentally focused forestry regime. Many Māori are managing both commercial and conservation forests using Te Ao Māori principles, which can provide not just environmental, but economic, cultural, and social benefits. So there's many options possible. But before we seriously consider these alternatives, a thorough understanding is needed of what is known about establishing and managing any of these alternatives over the long term. And this report tries to bring together this knowledge, but much more work is needed. And yes, to answer an immediately obvious question, more work is needed to understand how to establish large tracts of new native forests. While there may be an expectation that native forests should establish naturally and therefore easily, that is simply not the case. Environmental changes which have occurred since human arrival, I'm thinking of things like pest plants and animals and the loss of native seed sources, means that our help will be needed to some extent for new native forests to establish successfully. During this investigation, we talked to tons of people, and I encountered a wide range of perspectives about what types of forests should or shouldn't be incentivized or established. For some, native forests were the answer, while others argued that exotics were the only economically viable solution. In some cases, this just became a simplistic binary matter of labeling native forests good, exotic forests bad. But the evidence to support those sort of judgments is lacking. This investigation is ultimately about improving the evidence base to support a more informed debate, and that's probably the basis of almost every report that we write. Now, I'd like to walk you through some of the key findings of this report and my recommendations. There are 15 of them that can be grouped under 5 general headings. And the first of these is reform of the New Zealand emissions trading scheme. Afforestation has been latched onto as a cheap, easy way for New Zealand to achieve its climate goals. As I've previously remarked, this strategy only makes sense if your goal is an accounting one. The world needs real reductions in gross emissions, not an accounting triumph. But even beyond that, the strategy comes with significant risks that, in my view, aren't worth running. Now, again, I've outlined these risks before, but to recap briefly, at the heart of our ETS is a deeply flawed assumption that long-lived carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere can be offset by carbon storage in forests. For this to be true, these forests would need to effectively remain there forever to match the life of the carbon emissions they're offsetting, something that we simply cannot guarantee. Fire, disease, extreme weather events as a result of climate change itself all threaten these forests. Now, the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme is currently the main driver of land use change in New Zealand, and the social and economic costs are becoming more and more evident. If we continue to emit carbon dioxide and fail to reduce gross emissions, we will need to plant more and more forests. This will lock up large areas of land in carbon forest, effectively removing future land use options and further disrupting rural communities. Future generations will also be faced with the cost of maintaining a much larger forestry estate in a warming world. Furthermore, forestry offsets are putting the long-term viability of the ETS itself at risk. Modelling from various sources predicts that in the mid-2030s, there will be a glut of forestry units in the ETS, causing the price to start falling. And this will leave us with an ETS that can deliver neither tree planting nor emissions reductions, threatening the country's ability to meet our climate targets. But if the low price continues, because we are not reducing our emissions, we'll then eventually need to begin planting trees again because we're still emitting fossil fuel emissions. So we could go from boom to bust and back again. And despite this uncertain and volatile market outlook, if you look out over the next couple of decades, we will need to keep the ETS going to ensure that we retain the existing stock of forests in perpetuity. Now, we'll be releasing some modelling probably next week that supports these conclusions, so some of you may be interested in that. But in this report, I just repeat what I've recommended previously, and is to me the simplest solution. Forestry offsets should be phased out of the NZ ETS. You'd need to do this in an orderly way. Forests that are already registered would need to be grandfathered, but no additional forests should be registered so that over time, the supply of forestry offsets would decline. This would lead to a simpler fossil fuel only ETS, which would drive carbon prices up and gross emissions down, just as an ETS is supposed to do. This rising carbon price would likely lead to increased revenue from the government's auction of credits. The auctions were clear, and you could then use some of those funds to support afforestation initiatives in the areas that need it most, such as native afforestation in places with highly erodible soils. Whenua Māori would, in many cases, have a priority claim to any such targeted funding, given the limited option value that applies in many areas of land in Māori ownership. It is important to mention here that this recommendation will be confronting for mana whenua, given the marginal nature of much of their land, which makes carbon forestry currently one of the only financially viable ways of extracting an income. I'm acutely aware of that. And I wish to emphasise that if you were going to do any playing around with the ETS, then Māori interests must be at the heart of our considerations. But to put it bluntly, I don't believe Māori landowners should be having to rely on a deeply flawed and environmentally unstable emissions trading scheme to restore the Māori of their remaining indigenous forests, or to convert land unsuitable for plantation forestry to its former state. A reformed ETS could be a source of finance for the owners of exactly this type of land. I've also argued at length previously, notably in my report Going with the Grain, that afforestation is an appropriate way to mitigate some of the warming effects of agricultural methane emissions. I won't repeat those arguments here, except to say that forestry offsets are better matched to shorter-lived, impermanent methane emissions. Now, the government stated that it will impose a price on methane from 2030. So setting up a separate biogenic trading scheme for use by the land-based sector would allow the people who live and work on the land to manage their methane emissions and decide where and how forests are established. But if forestry is not removed from the ETS, and as I say, that would be the best plan, then at the very least, changes must be made to address issues in the permanent forest category. The fundamental problem here is that eventually forest owners will reach the limit of what they can earn from carbon credits, but the cost of maintaining their forests will continue in perpetuity. If the carbon stocks in those forests are lost or degraded in the future, the landowner will face a huge liability. And if they can't afford to pay, the taxpayer will have to. Rules and expectations around permanent forests need to be clearer and focused on the longer term, as there may be little incentive for forest owners to continue to manage forests once the flow of carbon credits slows. Research undertaken for this project found that such carbon liabilities could be a particular risk to exotic to native transitional forestry, even in the absence of adverse events. Now, transitional forestry has attracted interest as it could offer a way of financing native afforestation, with the transition to native forest funded by the rapid carbon sequestration of the fast-growing exotic species. How the carbon stocks of the forest change over time is therefore critical to the economic viability of a transition. The carbon stocks within a forest will be affected by both environmental conditions and management decisions. And there are a myriad different ways you could do this. Because transitional forestry is relatively new and it's a multi-decadal endeavour, we just don't have long-run data to turn to. But we commissioned some modelling to at least try to understand it. And the modelling included in this report, and you can have access to the detailed report, is based on the best information we have. But what I'm going to just take you through quickly is only indicative. Okay. So the example we show you here is one of a handful of scenarios that Manaaki Whenua, Landcare Research, and Scion modelled for us. And in this scenario, radiata pine is planted and then thinned after 9 years. So the first little blip in carbon that you see is that first thinning. Okay. The forest then continues growing and sequestering carbon until year 25, when 20% of the exotic stand is killed through ringbarking or poisoning and left standing. This leads to a drop in carbon within the pine component of the forest. And then this treatment is repeated every 10 years until, by age 65, all exotic trees have been killed. Now, at the same time, a native understory has been developing based on natural regeneration and probably some enrichment planting, and from 25 years. But because native trees grow more slowly than pine, the total carbon stocks within the forest reduce as the exotic species are removed and the transition progresses. So this little line here is the total carbon. So that's what's happening. Now, this is just a model, okay? There's a ton of different ways that you could do that. Now, it may be that eventually the native forest will hold as much carbon as had been held at the peak. But that may take decades. It may take centuries. We don't know at this stage. It may, in some cases, never get there. Now, as I said, this is just one scenario based on limited real-world data, but what this and other scenarios that were modelled for us show is that a carbon dip is likely to occur over time. So depending on how these carbon changes are treated in the ETS, this could mean the forest owner faces substantial carbon liabilities as the transition progresses. Who owns the forest out there at the future? Do they have the resources, the wherewithal to actually pay that back in the meantime and maintain the forest as well? Now, look, I've drawn attention to this because I think transition forests merit particular attention in any review of the permanent forest category, but also from an environmental point of view. I think there's something potentially very interesting here. It could be a promising route to restoring Indigenous forests in some places, but we need to understand the risks, and the permanent forest category's treatment of them needs to be clear and transparent. Finally, the risks associated with forestry impermanence should also be reflected in the price of forestry credits by discounting it. And remember, I'm saying that if you're going to continue to have forestry in there, I would remove it. But if you're going to have it in there, then I think you should be discounting the value of the credits to reflect forest impermanence. The Crown's heavy reliance on forestry as a way of meeting its climate change commitments opens it up to a wide range of risks and liabilities from forest impermanence. The Crown has transferred some of the risk of carbon loss to forestry owners, of course, who've joined the ETS. Of course, they have to be able to make good, and if they can't, the liability and risks will boomerang back to the Crown. And we've got this that diverged from my notes. This is a test of whether I can remember acronyms. We have the Temporary Adverse Events Suspension.
Yep.
Got it, TEAS. And what the government's done is said, oh, well, if you've planted a forest, and then there's an adverse event, like a big cyclone or a fire goes through, then you don't have to pay back. You don't have to surrender units for the carbon that's gone back to the atmosphere. It's all right. Just park it, and we'll wait till the carbon's back there, and then we pick up. What they've done, it's effectively an invitation to say, well, we'll take the risk. You don't have to take the risk. And just from a moral hazard point of view, it's an interesting way to treat the problem. You might just want to reflect on that. Both the Crown and foresters need to be more aware of the risk that forests, particularly permanent forests, face and proactively manage those risks. And the report provides some more detail on key components to implement this recommendation. There's an excellent case for ongoing production forestry and further afforestation with radiata in places where it makes commercial sense. But a radiata pine clearfill regime is clearly not the right approach everywhere. And in the wrong place, it can lead to serious harm, as we saw in Tairāwhiti recently. So you won't be surprised to hear me say clearfill harvest should be banned in areas where it is identified as high risk. But let's be clear, Tairāwhiti is not all of New Zealand. This is an exceptional case. There are plenty of places where those risks are much more manageable. The government and regional councils must regulate forestry appropriately. In some cases, the negative effects of clearfill production forestry spill beyond property boundaries. So taking responsibility for these spillovers must become part of the cost of doing business. If the cost of avoiding or mitigating such effects makes the current regime uneconomic in some places, then the regime must change. Otherwise, we're just choosing to degrade the environment further. Now, where clearfill regimes with radiata pine are inappropriate, alternative forestry systems, such as continuous cover forestry or coppicing species, could be suitable, and they offer environmental benefits and may be novel commercial options. Purposefully established native forests could also play a greater role in timber production. But currently, these alternatives are constrained by a variety of regulatory, economic and information barriers. My report discusses both these alternative systems and barriers. For instance, under the Forests Act 1949, planted native forests are exempt from the harvesting provisions of the Act, while regenerating forests face strict restrictions. Now, establishing native forests at scale through assisted natural regeneration is more likely to succeed and be successful than widespread planting. But you can plant and harvest, but you can't regenerate and harvest. So the regulations don't make sense. Landowners are disincentivized from working with nature for fear of limited returns and loss of future option value. There are also differences in how councils treat native harvest carried out under the Forests Act. In some cases, it's permitted. In other cases, it requires a resource consent. And currently the building standards, under our building standards, alternative timbers are not well represented as acceptable solutions, is what they're called, meaning that there are more barriers to their use. The committees that set and review the standards are structured in such a way that industry incumbents can prevent consensus and delay outcomes that would benefit or enable alternative species. Now, reforesting parts of New Zealand could deliver clear environmental and biodiversity benefits in some places. Resilient forests will be increasingly important for climate adaptation. These new forests could be made up of native species or exotic species with beneficial traits. There are two key barriers to establishing such forests: funding and a lack of information. The upfront costs of establishing new alternative forests, particularly native forests, can be substantial. And perhaps even more challenging are the ongoing costs of maintenance over the life of the forest. But without this long-term management, forests risk being overwhelmed by pressures from, mammalian browsers or weeds. Many of our mature native forests are already suffering the effects of decades of on-again, off-again management. Now, as I've said, possible funding streams could include auction revenue from a reformed ETS, or taxpayer subsidies, or, we're hearing a lot of this, payment for ecosystem services from the private sector. The last of these really is getting a lot of press at present. I am sceptical about its feasibility. Very simply, why would there be private sector demand to start paying for ecosystem services that currently don't command a market? To protect any public investment that might be made, and recent schemes like 1 billion trees and Jobs for Nature have poured a ton of money into various plantings, funding should be directed to areas where reforestation is both most needed and most likely to succeed, with maintenance, monitoring, and reporting plans made mandatory. We can't just throw money at this short term. As with many aspects of our environmental management system, a lack of information is holding us back. This needs to be a research priority. We simply don't know as much about alternative forestry systems as we do about the conventional radiata pine regime that we run. And these unknowns make investing in alternative forests a risky proposition. Now, the report set out to identify many of these knowledge gaps. I'm realistic. It's not something that a government could fill overnight, but I think it should be, the government should be setting out to fill some of these information gaps over time. After all, the forestry system we have today was started through government intervention and investment back in the 1920s. There's already a large amount of valuable knowledge about these systems held by the community, industry, and research organizations. A lot of it's learning by doing. People find out that stuff works and stuff doesn't work. However, the knowledge is often fragmented or inaccessible. And I think we need to find a way to make all the available information easily accessible to inform future afforestation efforts and spending decisions. I find myself saying this about almost every environmental problem. Something like weed busters, it is a way, except it's not being updated at present, but it is a way of pulling together knowledge so that if you want to know, how do I cope with that? You can drill into that. And that's really what's needed for forestry. Rather than having to spend the entire night on the internet trying to find your way around and get into stuff, and it may not be accessible even if it's there, being able to bring information together. It's a common theme of almost every report I make. This is one of the biggest roadblocks to better environmental management in New Zealand, the fact that we cannot interrogate a wide spread of dispersed data for particular purposes. Now, the current dominance of radiata pine, as discussed, comes with cost and risk, some of which can be managed by a more diversified forest estate. If our society wants to support any of this, any policies designed to encourage it would need a more deliberate, long-term view. because forestry is a multi-decadal endeavour. Short-term policies will never be adequate. We need to build knowledge, learn by doing, share the learning, and link foresters, landowners, and researchers in a productive way. And these actions require consistent policies and funding. And that will require some degree of cross-party agreement on the broad strokes of forestry policy. It's so easy to say this. So easy to say this. You could say this about everything. But unlike everything, forests are a long-term endeavour. So unless the nation has a long-term strategy for forestry policy, which it's investing in, reflectively, you don't have to stay on some myopic course, but unless we have a view about this for the industry and also for conservation, I don't think we're going to do a better job. Our future forests, will be shaped by today's policies, just as past policies created the forests we see today. If we want a different forestry estate, guess what? We need to do things differently. If we continue on our current path with the drivers that are currently there, we may live to regret it.